The desert has a way of swallowing sound, of holding secrets in her red canyons, of stretching silence so wide it feels like time itself has stopped breathing. On the far edge of that silence lived a man people barely remembered, a rancher, neither young enough to be called full of promise nor old enough to be called wise. He was simply there, like a fence post weathered by dust and sun, steady, unmoving, holding the line between the wild and the tame. His land lay low against the foothills, where mesquite shadows grew long in the afternoon. A patch of cattle wandered the open grass, horns rising like dark branches against the gold horizon. The corral creaked in the wind, the only music, save for the lonely cry of a hawk circling above. The man's name was known in town, though seldom spoken. Folks said he once had a woman, years ago, but she was taken by fever, or perhaps sorrow. No one knew for sure. He buried her under a cottonwood tree that leaned toward the river. And from that day forward he lived quiet, worked his herd, mended his fences, and let the world ride past him like a stagecoach too far down the trail to flag. He was 36 by the last count, though the desert had carved lines in his skin that made him seem older. His hair, once black as wet coal, carried strands of gray. His hands, leathered and scarred, spoke of years spent with rope, axe, and plow. Yet under the dust and callous was a gentleness many never noticed, for his voice was soft and his temper softer still. At night, when the world cooled and coyotes sang, he often sat by the fire with only the stars for company. And sometimes, though never aloud, he asked them if this quiet life was what the good Lord meant for him, or if perhaps he had been forgotten too. It was on such a night, when dusk bled into indigo and the first stars blinked awake, that the wind carried something different to his gait. Not the creak of saddle leather, not the cry of a coyote, but the uneven steps of a soul nearly spent. He rose, lantern in hand, boots brushing dust as he stepped into the cooling air. And there she was, a figure folding into herself at the wooden post of his fence. Her blanket was tattered, her hair heavy with desert dust, her skin marked by a journey too long, too harsh. She swayed like a willow bent against storm wind before sinking to her knees. The rancher's heart gave a single heavy beat. He had seen travelers before, peddlers, drifters, lost riders. But this was no ordinary wanderer. Even in exhaustion, she carried a bearing that spoke of strength. Her eyes, though dulled by thirst, held fire, and the pattern sewn in what remained of her blanket told him she was not from town, nor from any homestead. She was Apache. For a moment, the world stilled. The long memory of raids, of fires lit in the night, of blood spilled on both sides, hung in the air between them. He knew what her presence meant. Danger, suspicion, the weight of history heavier than iron chains. Yet in that breath of silence, none of it mattered. For what he saw before him was not enemy, not threat, but a woman collapsed in need, a life balanced on the edge of mercy. He knelt, lowering the lantern so its glow softened the harshness of her features. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembling as though she had been walking days without rest. Still, her back straightened when she realized his nearness. She did not beg. She did not bow. She only met his gaze, as though daring him to see her as less than human. And in that gaze he found no enemy, only resilience wrapped in weariness. Without words, he lifted her gently, as one might lift a fallen bird. He brought her through the gate, across the yard where the lantern's glow touched the weathered boards of his cabin. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and leather oil. It was no palace, only a rancher's shelter, but that night it became sanctuary. He laid her near the hearth. The fire crackled low, throwing shadows that danced like spirits across the walls. From a basin he drew water, cool from the well, and pressed the cup to her hands. She drank with the slow caution of one who has known thirst too long. Each swallow seemed to bring her back from the edge of some faraway darkness. When her strength returned enough to sit, he gave her bread. She ate silently, eyes flicking from him to the fire, as though measuring the distance between trust and betrayal. But he did not press her with questions, for he knew some truths are too heavy to speak when wounds are still raw. Instead, he tended to her cuts, cleaned the dust from her brow, each motion careful, respectful, as though he feared his touch might break what strength she still carried. And though she spoke no word that first night, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that kindness is a language older than war. Outside, the desert held its breath. The moon rose pale over the hills, silvering the grass and casting the corral in ghost light. The cattle stirred restlessly, as if sensing a change carried on the night wind. The rancher, sitting by the fire, felt it too. A shift, a beginning he had not sought, but could no longer turn away from. In the stillness, as her eyes closed at last in hard-won sleep, he whispered to himself. Not a prayer, not a vow, only a thought carried like smoke into the rafters. No soul under my roof shall be left without shelter. And in that simple truth, the first thread of a story was tied. A story that by dawn would bring hoofbeats like thunder and test the weight of his mercy against the fury of 200 warriors. Morning broke not with fanfare, but with the hush of pale light sliding across the desert floor. The kind of light that seems to pause before waking the land, as if it knows the weight of what lies ahead. Inside the ranch house the woman stirred, her blanket fallen to one side, her breath shallow but steady. The fire had burned low, its coals glowing like a bed of sleeping embers. The rancher sat in a chair nearby, hat in his lap, eyes heavy with a night spent watching over her. He had not slept. Perhaps he feared that if he closed his eyes, she might vanish like a dream, too fragile for daylight. When she woke, her gaze searched the room with the caution of a hunted animal. Her shoulders tightened, her hands curling as though ready to defend herself. But then she saw him, not looming, not threatening, only sitting quiet, steady as the walls themselves. And the fight in her eyes softened. He rose, slow as dawn itself, and placed bread and water on the table. His words, when they came, were few and low. Eat if you can. She hesitated, her pride battling her need. But hunger, like mercy, often leaves no room for walls. She ate in silence, each bite small, each swallow careful, as though her body still doubted kindness. The rancher busied himself with small chores, giving her space. He swept the hearth, refilled the basin, checked the fire. Yet his eyes returned to her often, not out of suspicion, but something gentler, like a man watching a wounded bird test its wings. It was only after the meal, when strength returned color to her cheeks, that she spoke her first words. Her voice was soft, carrying the music of another tongue. She said her name. He nodded, though in truth he did not catch the full sound of it, only the rhythm, the way it seemed to carry the wind within it. To him, it was less a name and more a story wrapped in syllables. She told him, in broken English laced with her native speech, that she was wife of a chief. Her husband, a man feared by settlers, honored by his people. Her eyes did not shine when she spoke of him, not with hatred, not with love, but with the weight of duty. She was not a woman who belonged to herself. She belonged to her people, to the fires of her camp, to the children who looked at her for strength. The rancher listened, never interrupting. He had little to offer by way of words, but his silence carried its own respect. And for a woman used to being spoken over, commanded, or dismissed, that silence was a gift. As the hours of morning stretched into noon, she rested more easily. Her hands, once trembling, steadied as she washed them in the basin. Her back, though weary, straightened with the dignity of someone who refuses to be broken. He noticed it all, not with the hunger of desire, but with the reverence of a man who sees strength where others see weakness. That afternoon he led her to the porch where the breeze carried the scent of sage. The land opened wide before them, hills rolling, sky endless. She stood there, shoulders lifted, as though breathing for the first time in days. And he thought how strange it was that a soul could look both fragile and indestructible at once. She spoke little, but when she did, it was often in fragments of memory. A childhood beneath cottonwood trees, songs sung around firelight, the laughter of women grinding corn, the footsteps of children chasing dust. Her words carried loss, though she never named it. It was in the pauses, in the way her eyes drifted toward the horizon, as though she could still hear echoes of voices long gone. The rancher shared nothing of his own grief, the wife buried by the river, the loneliness that shadowed every corner of his house. Yet perhaps she sensed it, for now and then her gaze lingered on him as though recognizing sorrow by its silence. In the evenings, when the desert cooled and stars gathered like 1,000 watchful eyes, they sat by the fire without speech. Once, coyotes sang from the ridge, their voices sharp and haunting. She flinched, the sound too close, too wild. Without a word, he took the chair closer to the hearth, his presence forming a quiet barrier between her and the night outside. She looked at him, then really looked, and in her eyes flickered the fragile beginning of trust. Day by day, their rhythms braided together in small ways. He brought water. She whispered a prayer before drinking. He offered food. She shared half with the fire as an offering to unseen spirits. He showed her how to mend a tear in her blanket with thread. She showed him how to braid leather strong enough to hold against strain. Two worlds, stitched with quiet gestures, without needing to name them. Yet beneath it all lay a shadow. He knew harboring her was dangerous. If the town discovered her here, there would be whispers of treachery. If her people discovered her here, there would be questions perhaps worse. And yet, each time he thought of sending her away, his heart grew heavy with something he could not name. It was not love, not yet. It was something quieter, a recognition of the rare comfort found in being seen, and in seeing another without judgment. One evening, as the sky bled crimson and the air smelled of rain, she spoke words that settled deep within him. Kindness is the strongest weapon. He looked at her then, startled not by the truth of it, but by how closely it echoed something he himself had once believed, long before sorrow hardened him. He gave no reply, but the words stayed, echoing long after she fell asleep by the hearth, her face softened by the glow of firelight. And so the days wove a fragile peace around them. Not love, not possession, but something more ancient, the slow stitching of trust across the wound of history. But peace in the desert never lasts long. For one morning, just as dawn stretched its first pale fingers across the hills, a sound rose from the horizon. Hoofbeats. Not one, not two, but many. The earth trembled beneath them, a low thunder rolling closer. The rancher stepped outside, eyes narrowing against the dust rising in the distance. The woman followed, her face drained of color, yet fierce with recognition. Her lips moved, whispering words he did not understand. But he knew what they meant all the same. They are coming. And in that moment, the quiet bond they had woven was tested by the weight of 200 warriors riding fast upon the ranch. The horizon shook with dust, a low brown cloud pulled forward by 1,000 pounding hooves. The sound was not a sound, but a force, rolling, living, filling the air until even the birds fled the mesquite groves. The rancher stood on his porch, arms steady at his sides, his hat pulled low against the glare. Beside him, the woman straightened her back as if bracing her soul against the weight of what approached. The cattle pressed against the corral fence, restless and moaning. The horses stamped, eyes wide, ears sharp to the thunder drawing near. Even the earth beneath the ranch house quivered as if unsettled by what it must hold. Then, like a dark wave spilling over the rise, they came. 200 Apache warriors, their ponies swift, their faces painted with dust and shadow, their spears glinting under the new sun. They fanned across the land with precision, surrounding the small ranch until it looked like a lone island swallowed by storm. At their head rode a figure that drew the eye, though he said nothing and raised no hand. The chief, tall in the saddle, his presence filled the space between silence and fear. His hair was black, braided with bone and silver. His eyes burned not with the fury of youth, but with the fire of a man long acquainted with power. Here was a leader of men, a husband of the woman who had lain in the rancher's hearth the night before. The rancher stepped down from the porch, each movement deliberate, as though the ground itself demanded patience. He carried no rifle, no pistol. His hands were empty, for some truths are spoken loudest in the absence of weapons. He walked forward until the dust of the riders swirled around his boots. Then he stopped, feet planted in the earth he had tilled, the earth that had fed his cattle, the earth he was willing to stake his life upon. He raised his eyes to the chief, not in challenge, but not in fear either. Simply steady, like the post of a fence weathered by every storm, yet still standing. Behind him, the woman stepped from the porch, her blanket clutched at her shoulders, her eyes alive with both dread and resolve. For a heartbeat, the vast silence between the three of them, husband, wife, and stranger, stretched wide enough to tear the sky. The chief's gaze shifted to her. It was not soft. It was not cruel. It was the gaze of a man who carried both duty and expectation, who saw in her not only a wife but the breath of his people, the thread holding together the fabric of his honor. When she met his stare, something unspoken passed, a language only the long-bound can share. Her shoulders lifted, her chin steadied, and she spoke. Her words fell first in Apache, sharp and fluid, carried with the rhythm of river stones tumbling in current. Then, with effort, she turned her tongue toward English for the rancher's sake. She said the rancher had found her broken and near death. She said he had given her bread and water, treated her wounds, offered no shame, asked for no claim. She said his silence was the first kindness she had known beyond the borders of her own people. The warriors shifted on their ponies, murmurs rising like the hiss of dry grass against flame. The chief said nothing, though his eyes flicked once to the rancher, measuring him, weighing him, deciding what kind of man would risk death to shelter another's wife. The rancher, for his part, did not step back, nor lower his eyes. His words were plain, slow, and carved with truth. No soul under my roof goes without shelter. That is all. The stillness that followed seemed endless. 200 warriors waiting for the chief's hand to rise. One woman standing between two worlds, her breath a thin thread. One rancher holding ground he knew might be his grave. Finally, the chief inclined his head. Not a bow, not surrender, but a mark of respect, rare as rain in the desert. His voice, when it came, was deep as stone. Honor has been shown here. The words moved through his warriors like a wind that stills restless branches. No one spoke against him aloud, yet the air remained tense, sharp with unspoken doubt. Not all agreed, not all trusted. The younger ones, fierce and eager, eyed the rancher with fire in their blood. They had not come for respect. They had come for vengeance, for proof that their people's pride could not be bent by kindness. And so they lingered. Day slid into evening with the camp spread wide across the rancher's land. Fires burned in the open ground, shadows of warriors dancing against the sky as the sun bled red behind the hills. The rancher's house stood like a rock caught between rivers, neither swept away nor untouched. That night the rancher did not sleep. He sat by the fire in his cabin, the woman beside him, her face lit with worry and weariness. Beyond the walls the sounds of drums rose low, steady, reminding him of the distance between himself and those who circled his land. She spoke then, voice soft as breath. Not all hearts bend to peace. He looked at her, and though he gave no answer, he knew she spoke truth. Some wounds of history run too deep to be mended by bread and water. Yet, as the fire's glow warmed the room, he also knew another truth, that sometimes a single act of kindness can hold back the flood of hate, even if only for a night. When dawn broke, the warriors remained, restless shadows against the horizon. And in the rancher's heart grew the sense that something was coming, a storm within the storm, carried not by the chief's command, but by the anger of those who would not accept his mercy. The desert was waiting, the air too still, the silence too sharp. The test was not yet over. The hardest part had not yet begun. The dawn came sharp and pale, the kind of morning where even the sun seemed hesitant, as if it knew blood might be spilled before nightfall. The warriors still ringed the ranch, their ponies restless, their eyes keen as knives. They had not left with the chief's word. Some fires die slow, even when water is poured upon them. The rancher moved among his cattle that morning, calm in his motions though the weight of eyes followed him with every step. The woman stood at the doorway, blanket drawn close, her gaze heavy with both warning and fear. She knew the look in the young men's faces, the ones too proud to let mercy stand, too eager to prove their strength in defiance of their leader. The chief himself remained apart, his camp set on a ridge, his figure still as stone against the morning sky. He had spoken respect, but even chiefs cannot chain every heart in their band. The rancher felt it coming before it came, like a shift in the wind before a storm, like the low hum of thunder behind distant hills. That night, when the moon rose full and white, the storm broke. A shout split the darkness, then flame. The barn roared alive in fire, dry timber catching like tinder, sparks leaping into the black sky. The cattle screamed, their hooves beating panic against the corral. The horses reared and cried, trapped in the blaze's glow. The rancher did not hesitate. He ran into the inferno, smoke clawing his throat, heat biting his skin. He tore open gates, drove animals into the open, stumbling blind through flame and shadow. Arrows hissed past him, loosed by hands in the dark, but he did not falter. Each life freed from the fire was worth his own. The woman stood at the edge, her voice breaking in cries to the heavens, her hands lifted as though to hold back the flames by sheer will. And when the rancher staggered from the smoke, coughing, his shirt singed, she ran to him. Not to cling, not to weep, but to stand beside him, a presence unshaken. The firelight threw wild shadows across the land, painting faces of warriors fierce and restless. The younger men pressed forward, shouting in their tongue, calling for blood, for vengeance, for the rancher's life to balance the shame of their chief's mercy. But then the chief himself rode down from the ridge. He came through the firelight like a figure carved of the earth, calm, unshaken, his horse moving slow amid the chaos. He raised his hand, and silence rippled through his men. His eyes swept the scene, the barn burning, the cattle free, the rancher standing tall despite smoke and ash, the woman beside him unafraid. "Honor," he said, his voice deep as thunder. "This man has honor." The words cut through the night, binding the restless fire of youth with the weight of stone. He spoke again, louder for all to hear. "We do not strike down those who give shelter. We do not burn those who give bread. Remember this, and remember me." Some warriors grumbled, their anger not easily cooled. But none dared step past the chief's shadow. His word was law, his presence too vast to deny. The woman stepped forward then, her blanket falling from her shoulders, her face lit by flame and moon alike. Her voice, steady as river stone, rose clear into the silence. Kindness is the strongest courage. Her words hung in the air, simple yet sharp enough to cut the wildness from the night. The younger men lowered their eyes, for even they knew truth when it stood before them clothed in firelight. The chief looked at her long, his jaw heavy with thoughts unspoken. Then he turned to the rancher. "You have given back more than life tonight. You have given respect." With that, he lifted his hand, and the warriors began to pull back. The fire still burned, but the storm of men broke and scattered with the dawn. When the first light rose over the hills, the Apache were gone. Only smoke lingered, and silence, and the charred ribs of a barn that would never stand again. The rancher stood in the ashes, his hands blackened, his chest rising with the slow breath of survival. Beside him, the woman looked out across the horizon where her people had vanished. Her eyes shone not with tears, but with something quieter, a gratitude deeper than words, a farewell spoken without sound. She did not stay. She could not. She belonged to her people, to the fire of her camp, to the duties written in the marrow of her bones. But before she left, she turned once more to the rancher. And in that single glance, heavy with recognition, was carried all that needed saying. It was not love as the world calls it. It was something older, simpler. The meeting of two souls who had seen one another without mask, without weapon, and been changed for it. Years later, the rancher would sit by his hearth, the fire crackling low, and tell the tale not as one tells legend, but as one whispers memory. He would say the bravest thing he ever did was not walking in a fire, nor standing before 200 warriors. The bravest thing was offering bread and water without fear. For in a land built on walls and wounds, kindness was the rarest courage of all. And perhaps, dear listener, that is what the West was always about. Not the guns, nor the gold, nor the land wrestled from stone, but the small mercies that stitched human hearts together, even if only for a night. So if this tale has ridden with you a while, let it settle deep. Carry it past this fire, past this story, into your own life. For you too may meet a soul at your gate who carries dust and sorrow in their eyes. And you, too, may choose to open your door. If this story stirred your spirit, let your voice join ours. Share it. Speak of it. Leave your mark so the fire keeps burning. And tell me, from where in this wide and wild world are you listening to these tales of the West?